Well, hello and welcome to the third panel in the Department of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies 2019 Social Justice Speaker Series. The name of tonight's panel is All of Us or None of Us, connecting the dots between Black Lives Matter in Louisville and the Americas. So thank you all who are joining us for the second time or the third time, and for all of the new folks, glad to have you here as part of the conversation. While I'm reading my introductory remarks, I'll ask that everyone who's here, all the attendees, if you could just share your name in the chat, where you're joining us from, and what your interest in tonight's panel is, if you have one. Okay, so while you're doing that, thank you to the event's co-sponsors, the Anne Braden Institute for Social Justice Research, the Commonwealth Center for the Humanities and Society, the Graduate Certificate in Diversity Literacy, the Departments of Pan-African Studies, Philosophy, Political Science, and Sociology, the Women's Center, and Pi Sigma Alpha, excuse me. We're grateful to the work of WGST Chair Don Heineken, Administrative Specialist Jan Rayburn, and Brandon Harwood in the Commonwealth Center. Let me acknowledge my fabulous colleagues and co-organizers, Drs. Kyla Story and Ann Caldwell. I'm Cara Snyder, she or they, one of the series organizers and the newest member of our WGST department. I'm so excited to be here at the University of Louisville. I moved to the city 3 months ago as the uprisings against anti-Black racism and state violence swelled. The world was watching Louisville. Recognizing this visibility, together with the folks from WGST, we conceived of an event that is both a celebration and a demand. We celebrate the vision and activism of local leaders, and particularly the leadership of Black women. And we encourage more members of the UofL community to join in the uprising. We acknowledge the tragedy of Breonna Taylor's murder at the hands of the police and demand all eyes remain on Louisville as the struggle continues. As organizers, we wanted to do a series because the fight for justice for Breonna Taylor and for the Black, brown, and poor residents of our city is an ongoing struggle with multiple intersections. Over the 4 panels in the fall, and hopefully more in the spring, we'll highlight the labor of the activists involved, like the fabulous folks we have tonight. And we hope that you all will join them in demanding racial and economic justice. So to talk through the 4 panels, we began by thinking about the intersections of education and activism. Last week, we discussed art and activism. Today, we take a transnational approach to organizing here in Louisville. And next week, the final panel looks at approaches to justice for Breonna Taylor. All events are free and open to the public. I'd like to remind folks that we have interpretation, sign language interpretation, and Spanish translation available. So please continue to share information about this event far and wide. The format of tonight's conversation is slightly different. I'll introduce each panelist before they speak, and then they'll speak for 10 minutes about the work they're doing. They'll also respond to the question, how do our struggles for social justice and freedom in Louisville intersect and relate to struggles for social justice throughout the hemisphere? And they'll pay particular attention to solidarities and connections between their work and the movement for Black lives. So with no further ado, I'll introduce the first panelist, Karen Moya. Uses pronouns she or her. Karen was born in Quito, Ecuador, and moved to the United States in 1998 with her family, so her father could pursue a musical career. She graduated from the University of Louisville, woo-hoo, in 2018 with a Bachelor of Arts in Spanish and Humanities. She currently works as the Adult Services Coordinator at Americana World Community Center, where she works with families from all over the world and uses her own experiences as an immigrant to better understand the community she serves. Thank you so much for being here, Karen, and I'll pass you the mic.
Thank you so much for having me. Good evening, everyone. Like Cara just said, my name is Karen Moya, and I work at the Americana Community Center. And, you know, part of my work there right now specifically is as a case manager dealing with crisis case management with our community of immigrants and refugees, dealing with things like eviction prevention, unemployment, anything relating to public services, and just trying to hold space for everything that is going on right now and kind of all of the trauma that a lot of our families are experiencing. And relating to everything that's been happening in the past few months, specifically around the Breonna Taylor case and Black Lives Matter, we've really tried to help the community understand, and specifically our community of participants. A lot of them are learning English. Their English is either a very low level, so it's hard for a lot of them to understand really what's going on around in Louisville and why things were happening, like a curfew, and making sure that everyone understood what a curfew was. So that's really been kind of the struggles that we've been dealing with at Americana. And then just to answer the question about how like our struggles relate to other things that are going around in other countries, I think it's really interesting to see how the Breonna Taylor case has awakened kind of in like not just Louisville, but everyone in like across the country, and just connecting through social media with our families in other countries, and just just trying to relate to what is going on. And I'm going to speak personally, like just trying to educate my family, where I come from in Ecuador, like having them understand like what is going on here. And I'm going to just use a specific example that I really related to when I was seeing the protesters of the Breonna Taylor case, and they were using the church, the First Unitarian Church, as a sanctuary. And everything that happened those few nights and what happened with LMPD really just reminded me of in Ecuador. Around October last year, there were instances where a lot of protests erupted all over the country because just financial decisions that had been made by the government that really negatively affected a lot of the working class people. And a lot of protests erupted, led by a lot of indigenous groups. And I think we can see a lot of that in other Central and South American community or countries as well, where indigenous people are really also taking a stand, and really standing up and fighting about how they've been marginalized as well, and how like the injustices that they've also been experiencing for so many years. And I think that's very we can really draw parallels to what we've been seeing in this country with the Black community. So yeah, I think it's just really interesting to see how all of those things relate to each other. And we're seeing a lot of reports of social justice leaders being targeted by the police, and like the protesters in every single which country that we're seeing on the news, you see police brutality against the protesters, which I think is also really interesting. So yeah.
Thanks so much, Karen. Hopefully people's question juices are flowing. And I'm going to give a moment after everyone speaks for the panelists to respond to each other. So for those of you just joining us, please take to the chat, introduce yourself, share your name, and what brought you to the panel, what you're interested in. Okay, so our next speaker, Sara Nunez, her is a doctoral student at UofL and former associate director of the Cultural Center's Hispanic and Latinx initiatives. Sara Nunez was born in Bogota, Colombia, and she grew up in North Carolina. She creatively weaves her storytelling, art, and movement practices through her work, organizing, and activism. She's a nonprofit and small business consultant, lecturer, educator, and organizer with experiences across several sectors. She uses healing, art, and activist modalities as avenues for creating positive, transformative, and systemic change. Some of her most valued community projects are Louisville Latinx Oral History Project, Louisville Latino Education Outreach Project, A Flor Herb Collection, and Collective, and Mi Gente. Sara holds a master's degree in public affairs from Western Carolina University, as well as a bachelor's of art and interdisciplinary studies from UNC Asheville. She is currently working towards her PhD in counseling and personal services from the University of Louisville. Welcome, Sara.
Hey, Cara, and hello, everybody. I'm happy to be here with you all. So many great folks in the house tonight, and just thank you for hosting the space and inviting me to be a part of it. For those of you that know me well, you know that I have a lot of opinions about this topic, and so I did prepare some thoughts as a way to try to help guide us, because we're talking about fairly complex issues here that I think can be really hard for us as Latinos to even sort of grasp and understand. So I just thank you for the opportunity again. And so my name is Sara Nunez, and my work happens through Mi Gente and through A Flor Herb Collective, which is a new herb collective I started right at the beginning of the pandemic, really, which also pretty much aligned with the timing of the uprisings, but around April and May is when we started the A Flor Herb Collective. But my work also really takes place in everyday conversations as a caretaker of my two elderly parents, in organizing spaces around fires and in my home. And I believe that as a mixed race Latina, it's my responsibility in my community, which is super polarized. And as we're located here in the Southern United States, that I work to fight anti-Blackness in myself and in my community as much as I can. And so as Latinos, we need to contextualize ourselves in the histories of our own pasts and what histories are here in Louisville, in Kentucky, and in the South for Black people. So there's a lot of work that I'm personally doing in my work, but also in that I believe that we as Latinos coming to the South, be that folks that have been here for a long time or even new immigrants, that we honor the history and legacies of the land and people of the South, as well as our own histories in Latin America, which are brutal, brutal histories. So in action, it looks a lot like relationship building, working with and educating young people, professionals and teachers, organizing, working, with my own self around these complex identities and experiences, and placing them in relation to this current moment in time. So also as a teacher and researcher, I'm working to understand more about how we reclaim healing practices in the spaces that we exist in, and healing practices that are actually going to get us closer to liberation. And so these practices can be found in ritual and art and activism, storytelling, language, herbalism, and in community, just to name a few. And I also use a lot of Black feminist frameworks in my lenses to the research, which I think really helps to push me daily to do better and to work harder and to help me to deconstruct knowledge. So just a little bit more about myself, but I think to answer your question, and through A Flor Herb Collective and through Mi Gente, which we can talk deeper about if folks want more like, examples and more details about the work, and happy to, share contact information and Instagrams. But I think back to this question of like, how do our struggles for social justice and freedom in Louisville interact and relate to social justice struggles throughout the hemisphere? I think it's important to note and share that you know, across the Americas and for decades, the same type of corruption. And I think that, you know, Karen did such a great job mentioning this, that, you know, the same types of corruptions that we have seen in the United States have been regular practices in our countries. There's a lot of history to learn and catch up to, right? It's from Argentina to Peru to Colombia, Cuba, the Caribbean, Venezuela, and so many more places have experienced, you know, displacement from paramilitaries, land stolen from drug wars, military dictatorships, silencing of protesters, los desaparecidos. It's a brutal history, and one that we're coming to terms with. And it's this like really complex, you know, way to come to terms, because we're colonized and we're also colonizers. And it's a racist struggle. Sometimes I think people try to make place for classism in there, and I think it's really important, but it's like absolutely racist, where the rich and white are made to believe that these racist white supremacist silencing practices are actually going to save the countries. And the erasure of Blackness and indigeneity from our histories as a mean to uphold white supremacist values. And so all these systems and all these values and these political ideologies did not just start with the colonizers and the enslavement of Africans and indigenous peoples in the Americas, right? It continues today. And there was a lot of uprisings right after George Floyd was killed in Colombia, specifically an Afro-Latino was killed, and his name was Anderson Arboleda. And, you know, they took to the streets in Bogota, you know, protesting. And I think, you know, it was like that fire that was behind what was happening in the United States helped to fuel, like, you know, these big protests across the Americas. And in this particular instance with an Afro-Latino. And, you know, sparked protests across the country to say, you know, police brutality against Black Americans, right? And Black, you know, Afro-Latinos is, you know, absolutely like, you know, has to stop. And so lots of examples that I think that we could also get into if folks want to talk and dive into that more around how I think anti-Blackness shows up in Latinidad or Latinos, and specifically here in Louisville. Would love to talk about that, but don't want to, you know, take over too much time. So, but I think that, you know, Latinos are not a monolith, and that we're making moves and standing in solidarity, but we're not all like on the same page around what it means to be Latinos working for Black liberation and for the movements for Black lives. And I think that it requires us to be very different in the way we do our work. And I feel like this is the reason why I move the way I move, and kind of in the way that I explain my work. And, you know, it's in my home, right? It's in the fires, it's in the healing, because it's embodied in me every single day. So it's not easy to just be like, oh, I go out and I practice this and I do this policy and I do this thing and I do this training. Like, no, we got to live it like every single day. So thank you again.
Thanks so much, Sarah. And I'll definitely have a question for you about kind of bridging being a student and being an activist. I know a lot of my students think about that and struggle with that. So I want to say something about the chat. A lot of you are posting wonderful introductions, and only the panelists can see them. So you have to click the blue box, the drop-down arrow, and make sure that both panelists and attendees can see what you're putting in the chat. So I suggest everyone go ahead and do that, just so by default you're writing to all the panelists and attendees. Then thank you all for being here. Also, I encourage you to, as you have questions, please put them in the Q&A so that when we get to the questions, the Q&A box is just erupting. Okay, so with that, I'll introduce our next speaker, T. Benicio Gonzales. T, or he or him, is a community activist with a focus on working for racial justice, immigrant rights, and queer liberation. T is an active community member committed to numerous organizations, projects, and campaigns, and is a founding member of Louisville's Mi Gente Circle. Since 2010, T has worked on several electoral campaigns, including for school board and Metro Council. Most recently, T has served as campaign manager for Attica Scott for Kentucky State Representative, and we're a huge fan of Attica Scott. T is a graduate of the University of Houston, where T earned a master's of social work. T holds a Bachelor of Arts in Social Work from St. Edward's University in Austin, Texas. T is a native of Texas, and he has called Louisville, Kentucky home since 2006. Thanks so much for joining us, T.
Well, thanks for having me. It's great to be with you all this evening, and to talk about something that I'm passionate about, which is what are the ways in which Latinx people can align themselves to racial justice in this place that we live. If we live here in the United States, what are the ways that we can align ourselves to working for racial justice, especially aligning ourselves to working for Black liberation? Like, what are the ways that we can really put ourselves into understanding that our liberation is truly tied to the liberation of Black people in this place, in this country that we live in. So I think kind of, I was thinking a little bit about Karen's, kind of introduction. And so I think some of that is relevant for me. I don't typically talk about myself, I feel like, too much, but I think it's important, for us as Latinx people to kind of understand like to really think about our own experience, like our individual person experience, as well as our historical experiences, and how we get to where we are, and whether or not, what ways that's playing out in the work that we do, in the movement work that we do. So a little bit about myself is that my parents were divorced when I was very young, like I was 2 years old. They, kind of each went on to have different partners. And my father ended up having a white partner, and my mother a Black partner, right? And so my life as a young person kind of being shaped all the time by the realities of race and racism, kind of from both sides of my family here. And I think about that often because I was learning as a young child the ways in which racism or white supremacy were really playing out, like not just big in the world, but like actually within my family and to my family. So I think some of that shapes like how I get to the reality of where I am today. And I mention that because I do think that we have to think about, what is that, what's a personal investment for us? Like, what are we gonna, in the ways in which I felt as a child, not being able to have control over the ways that these forces were impacting my family. What are the things that we can do as adults in order to retain some control there? So, but thinking about some of the work that happens today as a way of being able to say, no, actually we can drive the narrative of what's happening in our community. So myself and Sara and many others in this community are part of Mi Gente. So Mi Gente is a national national like activism and organizing group of radical Latinx people who have certainly try to have a radical politics that is, as we define it, right, like being unapologetically pro-poor and pro-Black and pro-woman and pro-queer, having that being an entry point into the ways in which we do our activism and organizing work. So those are the givens. Those are things that we don't negotiate on, and we move from that space. And I think it's really important for Latinx people living in the United States to be able to find spaces where we can work with others who may share similar, not always the same, but some similar identity and culture with us, to be able to be in dialogue, be in practice of like working against anti-Blackness as it exists within this society. And that has to, like Sara was saying, has to be daily practice work. Because the reality is, like many people who are not Latino, but who may be white or other culture, we too have learned anti-Blackness, like within our families and within our communities. And so we are on a constant journey in order to be able to unpack what that is, what it has done to us, what it has done within our families. I think, Sara was alluding a little bit maybe to what it is to be able to have these types of conversations within our families, within our communities. Some of my experience here in Louisville, I mean, one of the other things I'll mention is that I'm, because it's relevant to the story, otherwise it might not make sense, as a transgender person, right? So we mentioned Attica, but one of the other things that Attica and I have worked on in the past, before I was this iteration of myself, was recognizing the need here in Louisville to bring Black and brown women, specifically Black and Latina women together to share space, to share community, to share a meal and conversation, because we realize there really is a gap in relationship here within this community, and that's the case across many places in the country and certainly in the South, where these communities maybe don't have familiarity with each other. And if we're want to move in our social justice movement towards shared and like collective liberation, then we have to be in a process of getting to know one another. And so I think it's like a really important component of like what organizers can do in order to build power within our community is to take direct steps to build a relationship across these perceived and very real differences in order to start to gain an understanding. Sara was listing a lot of our history across many, across Latinidad, but a recognition. I remember having a conversation with a Latino woman here in Louisville, and she was expressing some frustration about what a Black woman didn't understand about her experience. And, I was trying to have this conversation about like, okay, so like, tell me what it is that you also know about her experience, right? So we have a big challenge, but also a big opportunity to be able to share and be in relationship with one another. And some of that because of the nature of the very big challenges that we have and huge policy issues at the federal level sounds maybe like minimizing what part of the solution is, but quite honestly, in terms if we're talking about activism and organizing work, we do have to do that relationship building component if we are to build that collective power together and not be such strangers to one another, which is the reality that we're faced with. And certainly for those of us living here in Louisville, I think it's a really significant issue that we have this great divide amongst our communities. And I think it's a real opportunity for those of us who are Latino to step up and recognize the places in which we might be able to build power within this community by joining with and aligning with the people, in this case, particularly Black people who have been working so long and so hard within this community and across the country, but we're talking specifically here in Louisville. They've been doing that work for decades and decades, right? So it's a real opportunity, I think, for us as Latino people to step up as our population here is growing, to align ourselves with those who have been doing this movement work for so long, and recognize that there is power in aligning ourselves with Black people for liberation and for justice in this community and beyond.
That was fantastic. And I hope that you are able to kind of see all the reactions in the comments. People have really appreciated you all sharing your personal stories. So Karen and Sara, I welcome you to turn on your cameras and your mics now. And I want to give you all a moment to respond to each other before the attendees get a chance to respond.
I kind of just want to respond to what T just said about how there is this divide within our community in Louisville. And I think it's really interesting to see how divided the international community in Louisville is, because I think everyone just comes from such different backgrounds. And when you think about your own experience or someone else's experience as an immigrant or refugee coming here, and it's a culture shock when you get here, and then you're just kind of like fighting to like survive and like figure out your footing when you get here, because it's so different from what a lot of other countries experience and like their traditions and their culture. And then they struggle when they get here. Like as much help as we want to give them, like it's everyone, there's so little resources to go around that everyone is just kind of fighting for the same thing. And I think that's why there is such a divide, is because everyone is so focused on their own struggles that they don't know how to relate that to someone else's struggle, I think.
Sara, I didn't know if you were gonna say anything. I think, yeah, I think for me, like, there is this piece about thinking about how complex it is for us to think about ourselves in this work. And I think that there really is a question before us. One of the things that, I mentioned Mi Gente, we have a local circle, but it's a national group. One of the things that we talk about there is that what's required of us in this moment. Our numbers in terms of demographically are growing all of the time. And, so this concept that like what we say is that, demographics is not destiny, right? And that there has to be not just more of us as Latinos, but more from us. And I think there's a real question before us here, which is, what are we going to claim as a future as our numbers continue to grow demographically? What are the ways, and we've seen recently, right, the influence here in the past week with the election, right? Like we have potential, like some serious power here in order to drive what the future of this place may be, right? And what this country might be. And in lots of different ways, not just in an electoral way, but also in an electoral way. And it's not insignificant, the electoral component. But I think that there's a real question that we will have to answer among us. And I think those of us who are aligned with Mi Gente or organizations like that are saying we want to claim a liberated future. And we know in order to do that, we must align ourselves with those who have been here for a very long time, working for liberation and justice. And certainly among those, like being Black and also Indigenous peoples here, right? We have to do that. And in order for us to be successful in that, then we will have to confront the anti-Blackness or the ways in which white supremacy has distorted our own mind in order to break through that and to achieve liberation collectively. But it's an outstanding question as to what we're going to choose. And I think it's probably clear too that there might not be exact uniformity across all of our nationalities here of which direction we're going to go.
Yeah, such good points, T, and Karen as well. Y'all really hit it on the nail. I think it's also really important to recognize that I think when we talk about like the resources that are available, that yeah, there isn't enough, right? And so like at what point do we begin to not necessarily have to rely 100% on the state or organizations or institutions to save us or to provide for us? Like, we know so well how important it is to build outside of the state. And one of the types of work that we do inside of Mi Gente is afuera del Estado, which is, not necessarily depending on the state to provide it for us or the next institution or the next nonprofit. Like, we've got the resources we need to be able to grow the food, to make the herbs, to get them into the hands of the people, to protect ourselves, to save ourselves. And so like, how do we do that? And I think this is also based a little in these abolitionist frameworks that are, around in these moments. And so interconnecting it there, that for us to be free, what does it look like to create the world that we want, that we dream so much of, and not so much waiting for the next organization to bring that to us, that we can make it on our own.
This is such an interesting point, Sarah. And maybe this gets to, it's maybe a question in multiple parts, but when I teach Latin American studies, so I'm teaching Latin American feminisms over the winter. And one of the things that always strikes students is how feminists in Latin America make claims on their state and actually demand of their state redistribution of resources. And so I guess one of the things I worry about is like, what are the tensions between like building autonomy or kind of independence from the state, while I think people in the US, don't make the claims on their state, perhaps as we should. There's this like taboo around welfare. And so that's like one part of that question, right? Like, how do we both push the state to be accountable to us who are the state and who pay their salaries, while kind of building abolitionism? And then I guess the second part of that question is, so all of us are here in Louisville, but one of the things I'm really grappling with that I would love to hear from you all is, how do we actually begin to connect the dots through the Americas? So here we are all in Louisville, but Sarah, you mentioned like a 7-year-old child who was killed by the police. Similar things are always happening in Brazil, which is my area of research. So so people all over the world are saying George Floyd and Breonna Taylor's name. Are we saying the names Marielle Franco? Are we saying the names Angelo? Like, which directions is solidarity flowing? And what might solidarity look like across borders?
I think one thing to mention is, like, I think we say a lot, to not forget our gender nonconforming people when we talk about women, like saving, like sort of that women in Latin America have, and yes, and so have people who don't, right, align in any one gender. But I think that question around like the strategies to like win and the strategies to like get the goods include both, like, we have to have Medicaid and Medicare, right? Like, we have to have government, absolutely, yes. And it's not the be all, save all, right? So it's not the one thing that's going to get us our freedom, right? So that's when I think when we talk about outside the state, it's both and. So it's outside the state, with the state and against the state. And that's how we move in our work in Mi Gente. And not to make this like all about Mi Gente, but if folks are interested, that's the way that we, our strategy and our analysis around it is contra el Estado, sin el Estado y desde el Estado. Like all of those things will get us.
Yeah, I think that like, yeah, no, I appreciate you like mentioning that, Sarah, because it's kind of like what I was thinking about a little bit when you were talking about Aflorar and everything. It's like that that we do have to hit on all of those levels, on all three of those places, the, you know, within, against, and outside of. And recognizing too, I mean, I think this is like one of those things, and, you know, Sarah and I in our friendship, you know, a lot for me, like, right, like we all might be suited towards a different type of activism and different type of target, you know, and yeah, we support each other across those, right? So Sarah and folks are working really hard to create this thing that is totally, that's outside of, you know, and what are the ways that we take care of community and build community that's outside of the state, and what are the ways that we can do that, and working really hard to do that. And for some of us, you know, it's the against the state is the easiest, right? Like it's the place where we feel the most, it's most comfortable, it makes the most sense. And we go for that, and it's strong. And still others of us find a place kind of within and try to make some change there. So we know that all of them are important. And we try to trust each other in each of those spaces. I think it's like one of the models that that we do try to exhibit, right? Is that we can be operating in all of those spaces, and that we're connected together by a common politic, and that we're operating that in each of those spaces. I think is really important for us, so that you know, it makes sense for like what like certain skills that we may each have, but also because we know that that our progress forward depends on operating it in all of those spaces. So.
Karen, did you have any thoughts? Or I can start moving to the questions.
I'm just thinking about how kind of socialism and capitalism, I know those words are really scary and people don't like to say them, but how that all plays into what T and Sarah were saying about with the state against the state. And sorry, I'm forgetting the other one. But like those three things, so capitalism is kind of like the scary thing that has kind of torn through like a lot of Latino countries or Latinx countries, and has created a lot of the poverty that we see, even though that all of these countries are super rich in resources. And I think that's interesting to see with everything that's going on here, and obviously the political climate, and how socialism and capitalism keep getting thrown back and forth within the conversation as well.
Yeah, it's such a good point. And what communism and socialism look like in Latin America, and I'm not like an economist nor a political scientist. So in this academic space, y'all, I'm just gonna ask for some freedom here. But I don't think that socialism and communism look the same in the United States. As so like when I talk about that historical piece, like we can move and immigrate to the United States, and until like you're here for 20, 30, 40 years, like have you not like read the history and understand it, especially the South? Like you're gonna come super confused, right? Like thinking that like the stimulus checks that we all got, not we all got, a lot of people did not get them and could not access them, especially our undocumented friends and families, that's a form of socialism, right? Being able to get that government, right? So I think that fear is a lot of misinformation and disinformation, and a very good tactic of the right and the far right and the Trump administration to get people to vote for them. They're one of the most strategically powerful and like very good at their strategy, and how they've been able to separate the Black and brown communities completely. Like we are anti, in some cases, and y'all see this play out every day. We have to see, if you're Black and brown living in this world, that there's a tension, and has done really good to pit Latinos against Latinos and Blacks against Blacks. Like, this is one of the tactics of misinformation and disinformation from the 80s. It's been going on for a really long time. So I think that part of what we're experiencing in this country is and the historical significance of what it meant to be like US-backed military dictatorships in most of these countries. So like it's both, right? It's like this, it's deep. It's really deep. Yeah. Not that I have answers to it all, but that it's like, yeah, absolutely. People are going to come here thinking it. And then folks like Mi Gente or other groups or BLM. I mean, that's what happened in Louisville around when the Cubans and Venezuelans came out and protesting BLM for the Nulu actions. And, folks were just asking for, race and equity of like employees and right. And some folks in the Latino community came out in pure protest of that. But we can't forget that a month earlier, they also had a pro-Trump and like pro-police rally south of town. Wasn't held downtown, and it didn't get that much press. But the same folks that hosted that rally against BLM were the same folks hosting, right, like pro-police rallies in Louisville. But we don't always make those connections.
Let me get to some of the questions because they're good ones. And Sara, this idea about like against, outside, within, this is fabulous. I can see the teacher coming out, and this is a really awesome way to conceptualize organizing and power. So thank you for that. Okay, so some of the questions, it looks like you've already answered some of them, but let me just draw Karen and T's attention to so Mary Sheridan would like to know if any of you all have suggestions for people they should read, especially from Latin America. And I'll ask other questions and then you can take some up, whatever ones you want to take up. Okay, so it looks like you responded to Sangi's question. So Emma Johansson asked a follow-up question about the election, and kind of what your response was to coverage that, the Latinx community is not a monolith. What was your response to this, both in the misunderstanding that Latinx people vote the same and that some Latinx support Trump? And then Mary Griffin has a question. How does gender, and in particular feminist activism, come up in Mi Gente in your political and social activism?
Well, how do we respond to, I think this is like, I don't know why, I guess I know why. It's probably just a lack of understanding about the really, like, the real diversity, like, amongst, Latino people, in this country, and we're talking about who's voting for whom. I am certain that this is the same kind of things that Black people in this country have to listen to, right? It's like, yeah, there's also like diversity amongst who's, like, who supports who, right? Like there's not Black people are not a monolith either. So that part is not, I mean, I don't think to any of us here necessarily that there's differences in how people voted is not a surprise. Some of us may even have some of that diversity living in our own families. I know that I do. It's really challenging. I mean, I guess we've talked about what are some of the issues when either when you're first coming to this country or even after my family's been here for generations. What is the messaging that we too are susceptible to thinking about scarcity of resources, or as we think about our own histories of what has been made possible or not possible in our own family lives, and what we think that might also be how we might impose that on others. We've talked a little bit about policing here. It's certainly, it is, without sharing too much of my own personal life, it is a to say even hot button issue within my own family would be understating it, right? It is, it's just to take the entire concept or discussion is a ticking time bomb, right? At any point. So that's the reality, but I think it kind of gets to what I was saying is like, what is the future that as our numbers are growing, right? As we increase in our portion of the demographic here, like what is the future that we're going to choose? And I think that's why, I know I don't want to speak for Sarah, but for Sarah and myself, like, and others here, like want to be engaged in thoughtful activism and organizing because we know that this is at stake, right? There are people there are Latinos in this community here who right now could be on a path to choosing what which is really not a liberated future for us all collectively. That's the reality. We have to be working in our own community in order to transform thought and action so that we have the opportunity to, not just survive together, but experience that liberated future together. And it's at risk right now. It's a really important, it continues to be really important moment after moment. But I think we also know that, I think what we saw in the election in places like Georgia and seeing what we've seen in Arizona and things like that, that really is evidence. Mi Gente and other Latino organizations have been on the ground in those places for the past several years, building up that power, having those conversations within our own communities, with hundreds of thousands of people, right? Over and over and making those connections in order to help claim a different future. And that work will absolutely continue. And again, this is one of those things, right? Literally not everybody, even in Mi Gente, cares for the electoral piece, right? The kind of alongside and within the state component here. But again, that recognition that our future is absolutely bound up in the outcome of this thing, right? So it's not the only place where we put our energy, but it is one place where we must put our energy and our voice because there's power there. And so as a community, as a collective saying we have to put energy, we have to claim this space here because there is power there, and power that we can clearly see is going to be impacting our community and the communities of other people that we see that we're bound up with. So I think it's, it's not surprised at all that we see those differences. I hope that more people will pay attention to the differences that you saw in some of the voting blocks along, for Latinos, like within the past week. There a lot of people will study that and try to figure out what's going on. But yes, those differences exist. And there are Latinos who are quite really passionately working for a liberated future.
Let me get to the second question then. I'll repeat it. So Karen, you can jump in here too. So how does gender and in particular feminist activism come up in Mi Gente and also maybe the Americana Center?
So this is really interesting with Americana because our international community is so diverse that it's really hard to it's just really hard to kind of educate the international community on social activism when this isn't something that they necessarily see in their home country. And I say that because a lot of the communities that like a large portion of the community that we have now at Americana come from Burmese, Karen backgrounds, Somali backgrounds, Arabic speaking countries. And I think like a lot of the backgrounds that the people have when they come to Americana are just like really just trying to survive, or coming from refugee camps where you're literally just trying to survive. So I think like what we really try to do is try to teach our communities how to be self-sufficient. And I think a lot of feminist frameworks, not necessarily that we would use, but I think a lot of them teach that. And so that's really just what we try to do is just teach self-sufficiency. And I think that also goes along with what T and Sarah have been saying about the framework that Mi Gente uses is the self-sufficiency part, because, as much help, like going back to how we lack resources, and you can't always rely on the government. And if you're undocumented, then like there's even more limited resources. So like, I think we really try to push the self-sufficiency part of social activism and feminist frameworks in our programs within Americana.
I think y'all have nailed it too, some with your like the cooperative business models and women making, or your members or like people making masks. And I think y'all have like a weaving group, or, and I think like KRM and some of the other Kentucky Refugee Ministries and some of the other groups have actually done this through like their cooking kitchens and things. So like you're able to create like these cottage industries, right, that might also support the nonprofit a little bit, but also give resources back to the people so they can be making the things that they're used to making and making money off of it. So I think that's really cool that Americana's, I don't know a lot about it, but that y'all done that.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, actually. So our Fiberworks program actually is just women, and they hold space for themselves. Right now it's once a week due to the pandemic. But we have a coordinator that comes up with projects, and we had a partnership going with the Speed for a while where they were making things, selling them at the Speed Art Museum. Everything is handmade by them, and all of the profits go back to the women, and kind of just teaching them a business model and like how to be independent and how to raise their families and self-sufficiency.
So T or Sarah, I don't know if you want to answer that one. Or Josie Timmons has a question about how members of the disabled community who might be unable to take to the streets can get involved and support the movement.
Yeah, I think this is a great question. And so, you know, one of the first things that kind of, for me, and again, thinking about movement broadly, like, right, that like within, against, and outside of the state, you know, I mentioned earlier my work on with Atticus Scott's campaign. But if you think just kind of broadly about a campaign, right? There's lots of campaigns, and I think campaign work itself is just so broad, right? There is so much of that can actually happen from someone's home, and is actually like quite necessary. I don't see it as, right, it's not like a smaller part of the work. There's actually just like really truly significant aspects of the work that happen there, right? So there's different kinds of like community campaigns where it's like, hey, like actually we need calls to be made, we need emails to go out, we need somebody who can help like with the talking points, or all of this type of stuff. I know like Sara and group were like making these healing packets for people who were out in the street. Well, they weren't making those like out at the corner, like, by the park. They were making that at home, right? So it's very much a part of the movement work. And I like kind of stick by that like strongly, that it's not separate part of the movement work. It's not lesser part of movement work. It actually just is movement work. And again, this is like really driving home the point here. Like we need people with all different kinds of skills and abilities in order to contribute to this. And thank goodness that it doesn't all look the same, right? That we're not all just doing the one thing, because we need lots of people who can contribute in just about every way possible in order to move our work forward, right? Like in order to get to the future that we're trying to work for. So I think that's a great question. And, any campaign, either if it's, for a policy or for an electoral campaign or whatnot, absolutely has those kinds of components that people do from their home. And I'll just say as a public health advocate too, like at this point, I hope you're doing a lot of that at home and keeping yourself as healthy, as safe as possible. Yes, if you have to be out in the streets, please wear your mask and all of those things. Try to keep some distance from each other, not too much, but some distance while you're out in the street to be safe. But all the better right now that if you can like connecting with campaigns in order to do work at home to keep yourself healthy and safe as much as possible, like all the better.
Karen, is there any way, I know Americana takes volunteers, yes?
Yes, right now, due to COVID, again, we're trying to come up with a virtual way to offer volunteer opportunities. But normally we would have volunteer opportunities with the FiberWorks program, any of our youth programs. Yeah, there's a lot of volunteer opportunities that we hope to kind of get back on track soon.
For people of multiple abilities.
Yes. Yes.
Fantastic. Sara, did you want to say anything or?
I mean, I think that there's so many, donations and meals and like, just lots of ways that folks can get involved depending on where your like heart is called, right?
I have a question for you, Karen, and anybody is welcome to take this, from Sangeet to Dave. How can we balance self-sufficiency and interdependence?
That's a really interesting question. I think because when you're learning self-sufficiency, you rely on someone to teach it to you. So it's really important that once you do learn how to be self-sufficient and you're comfortable being independent, kind of just pass it on and teach someone else to be self-sufficient and just kind of keep the wheel going.
How might folks from Mi Gente think about that question?
Well, I think the thing that I would say is, right, this like outside the state, right, this autonomous piece here is not autonomy from each other, but from the state, right? So there very much still is interdependence there in that work, you know, I mean, right, in the work that Sarah's doing, I mean, right, it has collective in the title, right? So there is absolutely interdependence. It's just that making that work like, you know, self-sufficient from the state, but not from each other.
Do you all have any thoughts about cross-border activism? There've just been a few things in the chat, so I'm not sure if any of your organizations are like actively working with folks outside of the US, or what your kind of like utopian visions of cross-border solidarity might look like.
The tough one, because we've got so much to do here and so much building to do, I think, inside of our, not only the complexities that we experience inside of these identities, but these histories and being based in the Southeastern United States and all of that. But I think Puerto Rico, I mean, it's still part of the United States, but there's a lot happening in Puerto Rico. And I think that, I mean, I think it depends on the kind of work that folks are engaged with. I think across union organizing, I think across climate change, definitely for the movement for Black Lives, that there's, you know, I mean, I think that there's a lot happening. How much, you know, I think in food sovereignty and like, right, like all these things, there's a lot that's happened over the years, but I don't know how much there's a, you know, folks are actually able to get there right now because of the pandemic. Like on the ground to right experience and do that work, which Mi Gente has done some of, but outside of the border, I mean, the work that's happening on the border, the US-Mexican border, which it's been a few years since Mi Gente's done direct action in that space. And definitely as they've become more and more militarized and more policed, it becomes more and more dangerous. So over the years, there hasn't really been a big push to like send people, like, don't go to the border, right? Unless you're invited, you know, like don't go to these communities unless you're invited, right? And like, there's a lot there that I think that, you know, yeah, where the question is, I think, connecting the dots to the Americas, I think that just all the issues that we're fighting for is not just, it's, you know, America being America, right? The United States, Canada, and Latin America, but they're global issues that we're all dealing with: racism, classism, homophobia, women's rights, you know, food access. All this stuff is a global issue. And so, I mean, there's specific questions, but I mean, I think there's groups that folks can get involved with across the Americas, across the globe. And that, you know, if you go, just, you know, go with groups that you're invited to be in those spaces with, and question these things around, you know, the white savior complex and a lot of that, where a lot of folks, yeah, it's a lot to talk about there. If there's specific questions, happy to engage.
Well, let's take it to the police. I'm looking at you. We're talking about a militarized border. I think maybe a lot of where the the violence that has been perpetuated from the US military in the Americas and across the world. And here we are in Louisville asking to defund the police and having budgets re-upped. So so where are we with that? And maybe you can, if you feel comfortable, like talking about what are some of the debates that folks are having.
That's a question for me.
You can start.
I might pass it to others, but I think here's what I will say is that I think it is absolutely always right for the people to be able to speak to their government, and that government is funded by you, to be able to say what are the ways in which we should spend the dollars that we collectively pull together, right? Our tax dollars, right? But our collective resources, what are the things that we're going to support? And, you know, I think that there is a big call for, in our community and in communities across the country to think about, to maybe reimagine what health and safety look like. So, you know, I will always say that I think it's important that people be aware of the ways in which your public dollars are spent, and to think about whether or not that serves, like, right, like there's a lot of people here that are clearly, like, I'm looking at some of the comments in the chat, you're clearly interested in working towards and envisioning a new kind of future, right? So becoming aware of, like, what are the ways in which your local government uses your financial resources in order to, like, how it disperses that back out into the community and what types of services. So I will just say that I think that I think there's real possibilities, and thank goodness for lots of organizers and activists right now working in community to help more and more people think about what health and safety can be and what it ought to be, and that you know, I think some of the this big push right now and thinking about you know, where money is allocated. What I do know, my experience tells me that it will take a lot of pushing in order to see significant change. You know, I think not just here locally, but I think probably in most communities across the country. But that's the call that, you know, if as a community, there's a vision for something different, then it's really the call of activists and organizers in order to, like, push push the community and mobilize community towards that new vision, or maybe not a totally new vision, but you know, but maybe a little bit of a new vision. I think that maybe it's not a new vision for everyone, but I think it is. I think the possibilities are being created in more minds, like, all the time. And that really can be attributed to activists and organizers. And it has to be said, like, truly led by, you know, mostly Black activists and organizers who are driving that vision, are responsible for, quite honestly, even you asking that question, right? And for us to have any kind of public discussion about that. So I think some of the other things I have to say that there's lots of different ways, I think, for Latino people to be working for the movement for Black lives and for Black liberation. And, you know, I think some of that then it means, like, what are the ways in which we're supporting Black leadership right? And radical Black leadership. And I mention that because that's like it's a tangible way, right? What we're talking about here is decisions about how budgets get spent. And a lot of time that's elected people who start to make those decisions. So, what are the ways that we as Latino people and others who are interested in this then be able to support Black leadership largely, but then also like Black elected leadership who might move us closer to a different type of vision that the community is holding. I think is work that we have to do. It's like, it's certainly one of the reasons why I, support Attica in her work. But not everybody, like, you don't have to necessarily lead a campaign like that, but there's lots of different ways to support, and from our organizations and institutions that we're a part of to elected officials, supporting Black leadership, I think is one of the ways that we can help move ourselves faster towards that new vision.
That's a great seg into the final question. It doesn't look like we have any more questions from the audience. And so the question we've been asking at the end of every panel, sort of for like feminist reflexivity, but also because we want to host another series of panels in the spring that talk about things like food justice. And so the question is, how can institutions continue to support activists like you all? What did this panel do? And how did it serve you and the movement, if at all?
I didn't know if you were going to jump in, Sarah. I will say that, I did, it's just part of work life that I have to, I sit on a number of panels and things like that. It was kind of interesting for me, I think, to think about, Sarah and I have this discussion a lot about what is it to be Latino in Louisville? What is it to be a Latino person who is participating in activism or organizing work here? I mentioned a little bit earlier in discussion that I've now been here about 14 years. It is changing. So I will say for me, participating tonight is going to help me reflect a little bit about I think some of the ways that Louisville or that Kentucky might be changing. And what are the ways, Sarah and I talk about this all the time, what are the ways then that we as Latino people are going to, what is our role and what is our place here? I think we're trying to live into what that is. We're just living into what the answer of that might be. But so I appreciate the opportunity to discuss some of that here tonight.
Sarah, I don't know if you were gonna say anything. Okay. I just want to say that in relation to, how can institutions support activists? I think we've all had this thought is don't just make, just like a blanket statement supporting Black lives. I think we all saw a little bit of that during the last few months, especially when the protests first started. Kind of take accountability for the way that you have not been supporting Black lives up until now within your institution, and make actual policy changes to actually support Black lives and to be a part of the Black liberation. I think like when it comes to institutions like educational institutions, when you have student activists, I think there needs to be a discussion of how do you protect your student activists? What happens? What happens if they get arrested during a protest? I think a lot of like academic scholarships and like financial aid rely on not getting arrested. So I think that's a discussion that also needs to be had with educational institutions. And as far as what this panel did for me, I really think that it helped me reflect on everything that has been going on and just kind of remind myself of the work that I need to do within my own circle, not just within the work that I do with my job or my profession, but just kind of personally reminding me of the work that needs to be done.
Such great points, y'all. I'd add that I think continuing to host space like this, I think is good. Bring on those, like, I know it's all changed with COVID, but Women Gender Studies does a great job and did a great job 2 years ago bringing, I think it was 2 years, bringing Shari Mordaga to campus. You all made that happen, which I know for T&I was like a huge, and I don't know, Karen, if you were able to go, but was a very huge opportunity. And so like doing things like that, and then getting us and being able to provide spaces for the activists to actually be in space with those folks, not just students, but activists too. So like if you host a lunch or a dinner, can a few, folks be invited to have some one-on-one time with those speakers? Or hosting them in an online event like this. I think it's it, continuing to push the need, or push the status quo around the conversations that we're having, asking those difficult questions, and then I think one of the ways that the institution's shown up, or other institutions have actually shown up in these times, is like supporting Black and Brown, business and folks that are doing work. So like I do these care packages, right, for caretakers and activists, and several different departments across UofL and other universities across the country have ordered them from me to be sure that their students have the kits that they need, or asked me to do, different sessions. And so I think that, and there's other people like myself doing this kind of work. You've got women at Americana making masks. If your institution's going to buy 150 masks, maybe you need to get them from Americana Center, or think about, partnering with T and the work of Mi Gente with, I don't know, Activism 101, or what is, I don't know what kind of sessions folks want to do, but looking to your own community. And I guess too, with research, I think like now's the time to be researching some really interesting things. And so all those researchers in the house, I think there's a really great opportunity, but for that research not to sit on a, on a desk and not get published or done in community or talked about in community, for us to be able to have access to those numbers and live with those numbers, be alive with it, could be so great in these times, not just with COVID, with the global uprisings and everything is. Yeah, so thank you again.
This was fantastic. What a great way to end the panel. Thank you all for sharing your brilliance, your ideas, all the important work that you're doing. And thank you to the audience for being so wonderful and active. The chat was on fire tonight. Y'all came with the questions. Thank you so much. And I hope to see you all next week at our final panel. So some of the questions around policing will definitely be coming up next week as we think about justice, alternatives to justice, transformative justice, working within, I'm going to use this there, hold on, but I don't have it committed to memory yet. Working outside, against, and within the system as we think about policing and beyond. So thank you all so much and have a great night.